this through. Maybe I'm wrong, but.
I have two very short and simple questions. One more about architecture, and one more about methodology. The one about architecture has to do with you speak about like the architecture of the Porfiriato in terms of its cursilismo, and in another book you wrote about the Palacio Azteca, and this experimental form of architecture where indigenous motifs were the central focus of the architecture. Why do you think that neoclassical architecture became like the emblematic architecture of the Porfiriato, and this other more experimental architecture, such as the one of the Palacio Azteca, became extinct somehow, or maybe slipped through just in small motifs of buildings in the 1920s and 30s. And then my other question is, when you speak about the Porfiriato, you focus mostly on state architecture and sort of big monumental state projects. And when you speak about the 1920s, you do sort of spatial analysis that has to do with everyday life, so to speak, the spaces of everyday life. And you focus more on individual stories. And I've seen that before, sort of the Porfiriato treated or viewed more as an area of prominent state architecture where sort of everyday life is not really studied or documented, and then the 20s as a space that are studied through individual stories, everyday life, etc. So I'd like to hear why those two different methodologies, so to speak.
Well, so yeah, maybe we can do these four and then open up. And by the way, just for other questions after the response, questions can be posed either in English or in Spanish.
Self-identification. The book is titled "I Speak of the City," as I hope everybody knows, is a quotation from a very famous poem by Octavio Paz, which is "Hablo de la ciudad," is the name of the poem. He talks about Mexico City. I didn't select this title; it was the press title, and they like it this way. And they published it. I was so thankful that I didn't know the subject. But it's, as a much more charming and smart person than me, that who I think was here before, Professor Gallo said, this is not that the I speak of the city doesn't mean that it's Mauricio Tenorio speaking of the city. It means that it's the city speaking of itself, or trying to speak of itself through me. Maybe I didn't succeed, but it's not about what I say about the city. It's trying to make the city speak of itself. In terms of self-identification, of course, I am everywhere in the narrative, because it is a walk. It's not that I want to identify the way of being Mexican. I want to identify the experience of the walker of cities. To put it bluntly and very crudely, if you want, I just wanted to make, how could I write histories of my works? What you see when you walk. The building, the entrance to the vecindad, the patio, the dock, the sidewalk, the garbage, the cockroach, the beggars, the trees. So the experience of walking in cities, what I did was, especially in Mexico City, it's very difficult, and with this I go to Professor Moya's question. It's difficult not to notice the density of time and space when you walk Mexico City. You feel like too many cities are breathing through the cracks in the floor, because beneath this, underground, there are too many cities breathing in the city, and it's very difficult. Poets do it much better than me, great urban writers or great chronistas can do it much better than me. But how could I write? How could I write? How could I create historical, professional historical subjects of analysis out of these works? And indeed, the way is a self-identification. Nobody cares about the rats or the lies but me. But how do I create out of this a historical subject, a historical theme? That was the difficult thing. And by trying to look in many archives, trying to look to one way over the other, process of experimentation to see if it works or not. Unfortunately, I wasn't, for instance, if I get fascinated by the dogs in the streets, I notice that it's not my problem. I mean, you go to the archive and there is a chapter on dogs in the archivo del ayuntamiento, and there are histories of killing dogs since the 18th century. So if I see rats, they have a history, and it's an important history. And the story is not only of science and hygiene, it's literature, it's poetry, it's the relations of all these people, or three traditions of science confronting themselves, the French, the American, and the Mexican, trying to come out with a solution for typhus, and confronting themselves, in which the city is not the site of this science, it's the subject. Whoever wins is because they know the city, because they know the rats that have been fighting in that city for so many years, the sewer system, the weather conditions, etc., etc. And in that way, the density of history, consciously, the word modernity, I believe, is not anywhere to be found in the book. Because it's a very slippery concept for me, and I believe I cannot say anything different than Baudelaire defining modernity or something. And so I'm very conscious not using it because it's very slippery, because what do we mean? Modernization in terms of progress, in terms of demographic growth, in terms of science, scientific hygiene, whatever, or do we mean the disenchantment of modernity? Do we mean the surmenage de la modernité? Do we mean the disappointment of achieving such a progress, of being conscious of getting there? Do we mean not getting there, but conscious of being there, or trying to get there? That is what it means to be modern, whether you are or not, but the fact is that you are now aware of your time existence. So I don't use that, but in a way, it is true what you say. I think that Mexico City is a modern city, not because it is by the 1900s. Actually, I say it several times. This is not Buenos Aires. Of course, this is not New York, because I think that those are the great capital of 1900s in the continent, Buenos Aires and New York. And this is not Buenos Aires or New York. This is not Chicago. But this is a very unique case because of the three. This is the only one which is not out of the blue. It has dense history. And it is modern, not because it's the largest, not because it's attracted more liberation, not because it is like Athens or Istanbul, but it's like Athens or Istanbul. Trying to refine in a way, it is very modern because this is one of the most modern examples of how to handle history and space in a modern fashion, in a modern state fashion. And as such, it's extremely successful. And as such, it gives lessons to the world of how to do it. And in that way, Chicago is not. And when Henry Adams visits Mexico, he thinks it's just another Chicago. That's a very successful part. From a very old city, to create the image in 1890-something, that is just another Chicago, because it's so money-based, so capitalist, so productive, so industrialized, it's a great success. Because you know what? It's a great colonial capital that was supposed to be the capital of the black legend, of all Catholicism, of hueva, españoles huevones, nobles que no sirven para the great grandeur of the great Spanish Empire and everything. I think that it gives lessons of how to deal with something that, I don't like the term, but modernity is very aware of, which is the density of the past. And the space and the city is extremely successful precisely because of the centrality of history. As we know since the Cortes times, this was not the right ecological, political, military, or any decision to construct such a huge building so far away from the sea, so high in altitude, and yet the centrality of history was such that it was unavoidable, regardless of all the ecological flaws and all the things that for centuries they will face. And it was, in terms of domination, in terms of the power, the attraction of the city, the right decision. As Cusco was never, and as Lima showed for a long, long time throughout colonial times. And that's why it's a very modern use of space. When I was writing these chapters, I was in Berlin, when Berlin was being reconstructed. And you see it all the way, and I said, you can get the Mexican lesson, you can really get the, in 2000, when I was in Berlin, it was all the time reconstruction, what to do with memory, what to do with that. And it is not the same story. It's the same process I have observed and walked and seen and transcribed in Mexico City. Now, in terms of the very interesting question, definitely is on Mexicans. It is not on Mexican. It tries to be profoundly Mexican. I must confess that here my good old friend Carlos Pereda, here present, wrote an essay on a short story by Borges, Sur. I don't think he ever published the essay. Did you?
No.
And I've been thinking a lot, and I heard him talking about this, and it's funny I came, I went to de-Mexicanize Mexico, and that's why it ends with Borges at the end. But not because I wanted to de-Mexicanize in the sense of, my concern was to return Mexico to the flow it comes from. Mexico is not a fixed category in any aesthetic, political, or anything. It's just the flow. The flow of all these contradictions, of all these things, of all these attempts, or everything. It seemed to me to fix. The only thing I wanted to do is to return to that Mexico I walk, which is ugly, is as Chicago, or is not Chicago, is profoundly Mexican, profoundly unique, as walking Jerusalem, or walking Sao Paulo, or walking any other city in many ways. It is nasty, it is ugly, and yet it's extremely excited. It is exceptional, yes, and it is not. It's just a repetition of many other things. And I wanted to return the Mexico to that flow. And in that way, if I were to put it in Nietzsche terms, I wanted, like Nietzsche would say, I wanted to do the critical history. But I was defeated by the antiquarian in myself. And I became, even in my Monsiváis moments, just Monsiváis, not because I had the imagination and the wit that Monsiváis had, because I had the erudition that Monsiváis had. Monsiváis had by nature, I had to learn it. I had to learn the language. I was not born with those boleros. I had to, it's not my age, we belong to another thing. So I have to learn that out of pure antiquarianism. To know all the boleros I know is pure antiquarianism.
Yeah.
Just to know it by detail and be able to repeat every single phrase by Agustin Lara is pure antiquarianism.
And also, it's antiquarianism in the sense that it's a recovery and appreciation.
Recovery, appreciation, and yet somehow, if you want, what I wanted the book to do is not to, I wasn't able to show that the critical can defeat the antiquarian. It's reviving and showing you, and especially in the language chapter, I say, forget it, I cannot ask, I'm just going to tell you how it sounds, so that you hopefully enjoy it like me. Don't ask me, just try to enjoy it.